Hey everybody, I'm Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas, and you are watching ATP, Ask the Pastor. If you have something you would like to ask the pastor, you can email me at atpholycross@gmail.com. We'll put your question in the queue and get to it as soon as we're able. In the meantime, check out the links in the video description below, one of which is a link to our searchable database of over 500 Ask the Pastor questions videos. All right, with that said, let's get to today's question. Someone asks, Dear Pastor, is it acceptable to use gluten-free wafers in the celebration of the Lord's Supper? What about grape juice instead of wine? Very important question. So when Christ instituted the sacrament of the altar, the sacrament of his body and blood, he used bread and wine. And Lutherans confess in the Formula of Concord that in the words of institution, there is indeed no doubt that Christ speaks of real natural bread and of natural wine, also of oral eating and drinking. So this means that the question really is gluten-free bread natural bread? And is grape juice natural wine? And the reason this is so important is because we also confess that nothing has the nature of a sacrament apart from the use instituted by Christ. What that means is that if we celebrate the sacrament using different words, different elements, different actions than the ones instituted by Christ, we're not celebrating the Lord's Supper. Now, while some may say that's legalistic, Christ says, do this in remembrance of me. And the church doesn't have the authority to revise, change, or amend what Christ has instituted and given to her for her benefit. So let's address grape juice first. So both wine and grape juice are made from grapes. The difference between the two is fermentation. Wine is the juice of grapes that's allowed to ferment. Fermentation happens when yeast consumes the sugars in the grape juice and converts them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Grape juice is the juice of grapes that is not allowed to ferment. So that juice is pasteurized, which kills natural yeasts and prevents fermentation from happening. This is why grape juice typically tastes so much sweeter than wine, because it has a lot more sugar that hasn't been converted into alcohol and CO2. This also means then, for our purposes, that wine and grape juice aren't the same thing. They're not different versions of the same thing. Now we can say with certainty then that Jesus used wine when he instituted the sacrament of the altar, because wine was a staple in first century Jewish life, including the Passover celebration. Now, there's no such thing as grape juice in the first century AD, because pasteurization, it wouldn't be invented for another 1700 years. And even then, it wasn't until 1869 that an American Methodist minister and supporter of the temperance movement by the name of Thomas Bramwell Welch used pasteurization to create grape juice specifically for use in his celebration of the Lord's Supper. Now, some will bring up Acts 2:13, where the apostles are accused of being full of new wine, and claim that that new wine is grape juice. The new wine, or glucose in Greek, is just wine that's been newly made. As John Chrysostom points out, since it wasn't the season for new wine, being Pentecost, the scoffers that day are attributing the speaking in other languages to the quality of the wine. So all this is to say that the New Testament, along with the entire ancient world, knew nothing whatsoever of grape juice. Jesus used natural wine when he instituted the sacrament, and we, following his institution, use natural wine. Now, in spite of this, many Protestants use grape juice, and sadly, many Lutherans do as well. And when they do, they deny their own confession, which states that natural wine is to be used. Grape juice is often used so that recovering alcoholics can partake of the sacrament without that becoming a stumbling block to them. The problem, though, with this is that by substituting grape juice for wine in the sacrament, that recovering alcoholic isn't receiving Christ's blood. Nor is it appropriate for the recovering alcoholic to abstain from the cup and have only communion in one kind, bread only. That would violate Christ's institution. He says, take, eat, take, and drink. So receiving communion under one kind, only the bread, separates what God has joined together. Johann Gerhard, writing in 1610, writes that if there are people who can't even take a droplet of wine, it would be better for them to abstain from the Lord's Supper than to only partake the body of Christ itself. Now, also, while we're on this discussion, it's worth noting here the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's 2001 Convention Resolution 316 to encourage the use of wine in the administration of the Lord's Supper. The Synod had to encourage the use of natural bread and wine, and by doing so, they were trying to curtail the use of all sorts of other elements besides bread and wine. The most egregious of which I ever heard was Doritos and grape soda. There was really no need for this resolution, however, since the Lutheran Confession state that natural bread and natural wine are to be used. And so by encouraging, not requiring the use of natural bread and wine, Missouri Synod inadvertently, hopefully, confess that those elements aren't necessary for the sacrament to be a sacrament. Now, with that said, we can pivot and we can look at the use of gluten-free bread. And again, the question is gluten-free bread natural bread? First, we need to answer the question, what does it even mean for bread to be gluten-free? Well, according to the Food and Drug Administration, for a food to be considered gluten-free, it, quote, must contain less than 20 parts per million ppm of gluten. This level is the lowest that can be reliably detected in foods using scientifically validated analytical methods. Other countries and international bodies use these same criteria, as most people with celiac disease can tolerate foods with very small amounts of gluten. So additionally, it says, the FDA says that if food contains an ingredient that is any type of wheat, rye, barley, or crossbreeds of these grains, it cannot be considered gluten-free. Now, historically, Lutherans have considered any bread made from grain flour and water to be natural bread. Typically, this meant wheat, rye, barley, and oats. In Lutheran lands, bread was made from grain flours, not potatoes, garbanzo beans, almonds, or tapioca starch. Since those aren't grain flours, they would not be considered natural bread. Now, while rice and even corn, when it's harvested, mature and dry, are grains, typically these have not been used for communion bread. Now, while any grain flour is acceptable, wheat is the most commonly used, since it would have been the flour used for the bread that Jesus gave to his disciples. Now, the Roman Catholic Church makes law of this. According to canon law, communion bread must be made from wheat only. So gluten-free bread is invalid for use in the Roman Mass because to be considered gluten-free, the bread can't be made from wheat. Now, I'm aware of one altar bread company that produces a low gluten communion wafer that's the best of both worlds. It's made of wheat, so it's valid for Roman Catholic Mass. The gluten content is also less than 20 parts per million, which is technically the threshold for being considered gluten-free. But since it's made from wheat, it technically can't be called gluten-free, according to the FDA. So that's probably the best option for someone in the congregation that has celiac disease. Now, I'm of the opinion that gluten-free bread needs to be made from grain flour, preferably wheat or barley, since that's what everyone would have understood as bread in the New Testament, and what the Lutheran confessions seem to have in mind by natural bread. For parishioners with celiac disease or gluten sensitivities, wafers made of wheat starch and water are both natural bread and contain very little gluten. And based on the FDA's definition of gluten-free, I don't think that gluten-free breads can be considered natural bread. Now, while Lutherans don't go as far as Rome to legislate that communion bread must be made from wheat only, the insistence that it be a grain flour makes meeting that FDA definition of gluten-free nearly impossible. Now, again, just to close up with this, this is important because the sacrament, in order for the sacrament to be celebrated according to Christ's institution, it has to use natural bread and natural wine. It has to be done according to his institution with his words, his elements, his actions, and his teaching on what the sacrament is and what it is for. This is why substituting comparable elements in the place of natural bread and natural wine makes the sacrament uncertain at best and a completely different supper than the Lord's at worst. Hope this helps. We'll catch you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.